Today I'm presenting a conversation I had with Zarius of the YouTube channel Base FZZ. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. If you're not familiar with the channel, and I recommend checking it out, Base FZZ is, I'll have a link, is a channel that looks at a lot of issues pertaining to young men in particular. So it's got to do with things like dating and the sort of advice young men get about dating, the sort of criticism that is leveled at young men, things that young men do right and wrong, and can and how to improve their life and so on. And it's an interesting channel. And when I asked Darius for a bio, he said a social commentator trying to do the best he can with what he's got, or words to that effect. I got the wording slightly wrong there. Anyway, it was an interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed being in it.
All right. So, the subject I'd like to talk about today is what I call religion replacements. So you could call them philosophies of life, but there seem to be a whole bunch on offer to young men these days. One of the ones I've noticed prominently in your videos of late is I think I'm thinking of the red pill philosophy. There's a young man who looks to be of Indian extraction, a British young man to be of Indian extraction who's big into grinding on your purpose. Is he red pill?
Hamza's hard to place, but I would say mostly. Hamza himself would probably criticize the red pill here and there, but ultimately he does tout the same message. So it's almost a distinction without a difference, you could say.
So I've heard that. I mean, the red pill has meant a variety of things in a variety of contexts. So in this context, could you describe the red pill, like the basic red pill philosophy?
Yeah. So basically, the red pill philosophy is basically the studying and understanding of, you would say, female psychology or ways to attract and have relationships with women. Is basically the best way to describe the red pill. Because, I mean, technically you could use the analogy for literally anything, but for like on YouTube, on the internet, it's mostly about men trying to figure out how to have relationships with women. It's probably the best summarization.
Okay. Now, I'm curious, because I'd like to get into the sort of worldview of it, but how is the red pill distinct from, say, is pickup artistry still a thing, or is that more from like a decade ago?
That's more from like a decade ago. So what you really have more now are like dating coaches is kind of the evolution of pickup artistry. And so the difference is, so pickup artists kind of kicked everything off. You have like the mystery method kind of books. You'll have the different pickup artists who like Roosh V that would write lots of books and were really in the field and doing like a lot of, I guess you could say, research, quote unquote, and trying to find ways to attract women. And then they write about their successes and their experiences, and they try to train men to kind of do what they did. So that's what like pickup artistry was originally. And there's a lot of like overlap between the different guys, like trying to show your social dominance, I guess, or more like try to make yourself stick out. Not so much being socially dominant, because that's kind of what it leads to later. But with the original pickup artist, it was more about like trying to stick out socially, try to be fun, try to look good, try to stick out, and then talk to as many women as you can, see where it lands, and just try to pick it up from there. So as time kind of went on, it kind of morphed into what you see now, which is a lot of like dating gurus. There's like a lot of different courses. You may have seen the ad for the girlfriend activation system kind of thing.
No,
Lots
I
of
haven't
different.
actually.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, that's a little bit of an old one. But the dating coaches now who are kind of having like the seminars are more trying to teach. Like I think you may have heard of RDS. He I forget his name, but there's different guys like Todd. So where they switched from the pickup artist was kind of more about, you would say, being kind of like fun. The dating gurus now are talking about like status and dominance and like trying to move up a social hierarchy to get more women, right? Like it's more talking about hypergamy. It's more of like, you would say, a philosophy where like, okay, so if I could say pickup artists was more like a method, dating gurus try to teach a philosophy, might be the best way to distinguish the two, because
Interesting.
they're all essentially like the same, and that is we're trying to get women to have sex with us, but kind of there wasn't like rules to say pickup artistry as there are like rules to the social dominance hierarchy and trying to like evolve in that way.
Hmm. Well, now, one thing, the pickup artistry very consciously had a very short time scale that it was operating on. Because actually, the mystery method is actually a really fascinating book. In part, just as, and this is a side note, but in part because a lot of mystery is a weird guy, from what I can tell, based on a few things. He was basically he was like a sort of like a really, really depressed guy. I mean, a sort of depressed sort of nihilist who distracted himself with human psychology, and to a great degree, his picking up of women was simply the, as you put it, I mean, this was like the experimental confirmation of his theories. Like he didn't really care about the having sex with women part. It was every time that he was able to have sex with women, that this would, was both more data and would verify his theories and prove that he was right, which was sort of more the game he was in. And so but one of the things that's interesting is a bunch of his psychological insights also apply in different contexts to men, because a bunch of them are things like a bunch of his psychological insights are things that are really about like considering from the perspective of like a person where a lot of people are seeking that person's attention. And if you're in that circumstance, if a lot of people are seeking your attention more so than you can give attention to, you have to start selecting amongst them somehow. And then how do you go about doing that? So like there are things in there that that are applicable to, completely non-sexual circumstances, where it's just like if you're trying to talk to somebody, there are things that are apply as long as you can change, see the kernel of what's the actual psychological aspect to it and adjust the circumstances. But it had a very, very narrow focus in terms of like a very, very short time scale. Success was defined as like over the course of basically a few hours, that if you could get somebody to, I mean, it was, literally they're searching for a one-night stand. And it seems like the red pill, by broadening its time scale, like the red pill is about having a girlfriend, not necessarily for very much beyond having sex with her multiple times. But would you say that's accurate, that they broaden their time scale, and therefore, because they've got a longer time scale, it kind of morphs more into a philosophy of life rather than just a method for accomplishing a specific one-off task?
Yeah. I think that's probably a perfect analysis of it. Yeah. I think that's,
so, now, does it have that same sort of, I mean, is this a thing where fundamentally the red pillars tend to be nihilists who've taken up a hobby, and their hobby happens to be on a long time scale, so it...
I would say, yeah, I'd say there's a lot of that. I wouldn't say that the nihilism mostly is found in, I guess, what you'd call the black pill, which is the offshoot of the red pill, which I know is kind of goofy to refer to these as pills and stuff, but if you can bear with me, so the red pill, I guess you could honestly, I want to say it's realism, but it's more about practicality. It's more about what kind of works currently. Whereas the black pill philosophy is there's not really any hope at all. Here's why, kind of thing. So black pills are like, here's why you can't get a girlfriend based on your genetic makeup. The red pill is like, here's how you succeed over time. So that's kind of what you'd say the differences are there, but both of them are shared in the sense that they're philosophies that revolve around how women are thinking in relation to men.
Now, actually, I should ask, have you read any Nietzsche?
No, I mean, I've heard a little bit, but I haven't read any.
Okay, the reason I bring up, because actually, super fast, just to give context to when I talk about the fundamental nihilism, because I'm actually going in a little bit, because nihilism is not intrinsically depressive. Or at least it is in a sense. I mean, you're eventually going to wind up insane, but it doesn't necessarily go straight there, because Nietzsche held that the death of God was the greatest tragedy. Death of God, of course, being a metaphor for people losing their belief in God. But he held that this is the greatest tragedy to befall humankind, because now we have no grounding, we have no foundation for anything. There is no good and evil don't mean anything. There's nothing to direct human life. And so what's necessary is for somebody and this is where he had the idea of the overman or the superman, would step up and create a tablet of, essentially take over God's job to create a tablet of values and that's why one of his books is called Beyond Good and Evil. And it was consciously choosing that sort of physical metaphor, not above, because that would imply values, but rather to simply move beyond good and evil into creating some values so that it would then be possible to live. Because without values, you can't live. There's no way to say that one thing's better than another unless you have something to measure them by. And so so there is that sort of intermediate stage of nihilism before you eventually go insane and grow the giant mustache and dance around naked thinking you're Dionysus. Is that you can try to do that. You can try to come up with some sort of tablet of values that you then pursue because, well, you're here and you got to do something. And so when I was asking if it was fundamentally nihilistic, I don't mean that it was necessarily holding that everything is bad. It could be in that stage of nihilism where you're trying to create a tablet of values, or possibly, and I'm curious if you think they're doing this, if they're actually trying to push the job of creating the new tablet of values onto women. That instead of creating their own values, like, well, you guys value something, that's good enough, we'll follow that. Do you think they're doing that?
Yes. And yeah, I would say mostly yes. The first part of nihilism, where you're saying that they're trying to create something kind of like beyond good and evil, trying to figure out how they should operate in the world currently because they don't really have anywhere else to go, I would say absolutely. Can you repeat the second part of your question? Because I'm not sure if they're trying to put it. I don't think they're trying to put it on the women, but I don't know if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah. Okay. So to make sure that's clear, what I mean is that so of course Nietzsche didn't think he himself was the overman. He just thought of himself essentially as like John the Baptist for the overman, that he was hoping his writings would produce the overman who would come and save humanity from this morass of meaninglessness. And so the problem is just because to be the overman, to be the Superman is superhuman. It's above human. You're stronger than other men. Because ordinary people can't do this. Ordinary people can only conform to some sort of idea of good and evil. They can't create one. And so he was hoping that Superman would come, and being the Superman, of course, is kind of too hard for most people. And so what I'm wondering is if the Red Pillars aren't trying to be the Superman themselves. They're not trying to create the values, but they recognize that women have strong opinions on things. Women have strong values. Women care deeply about some things. And if they're not, what I'm wondering is if they're seeing that and saying, like, okay, here's somebody who cares about something. That's like having a tablet of values. So I can't create my own, but like she seems to have one. So maybe I'll try to conform to that tablet of values. And if I can be whatever good means according to this tablet of values, then my life has some sort of purpose.
I think in a roundabout way, I wouldn't say directly, but I think that you could make the argument that they are kind of accidentally. And what I mean by that is it's not so much that like they look at women as, I guess you could say, the Ubermensch. It's that they want to become the Ubermensch based on what women want. So in that sense, women direct the type of men that they're going to be. So if they need status, if they need money, if they need to look good, if they need to be, muscular, work out a good bit, that's what they're going to shift into trying to become. If they have to be a bit colder and not really care too much about women's opinions, then that's the man that they're going to be, because that's what's necessary to get women to follow them, or that's what's necessary to get the women to come flock to them. So it's not exactly I'm going to be what women want, like they won't directly say that, but that's what it is essentially. They're just morphing into what women are responding to.
So one thing that's commonly the case is that it seems like men tend, broadly with exceptions in both males and females, that men tend to be a bit more motivated by philosophy, which means that if they don't have one, philosophy of life, that they tend to be very directionless, whereas women tend to have a stronger set of instincts that direct them to things. So that if a woman does have a philosophy of life, she can, as a rational creature, overpower this and so on. So, if a woman can, a religious woman can do, anything that she considers to be good and overpower her instincts. It may require, more willpower for a particular instinct where a man doesn't have that instinct. But, but when you're talking about So if you have a man and a woman, neither of whom has a philosophy of life, or more properly, their philosophy of life is, as G.K. Chesterton would put up, the used up scraps of somebody else's philosophy. The that at least the woman will have these strong instincts that if she doesn't have any rational purpose to her life, she still has these instincts that make her care deeply about a whole bunch of things. Whereas a male with no philosophy of life will just have fewer things he's inclined by instinct to care about. And so it seems like there's at least a possibility that men could therefore drift to women and sort of depend on them. If neither of them has any idea of what they're supposed to be doing, at least the woman will have stronger instincts to do something, so that becomes something to do, some reason to get up, in the morning.
Well, I think for a lot of young ladies, it's probably a little bit more reactionary than it is like they're kind of thinking. So it's more like the men seek philosophy because they kind of have a lot of free time and a lot of things to do. And without any, I guess you'd say, purpose or direction in life, if you are jobless, you kind of can only really sit around by yourself or play video games or watch pornography. I mean, or read books. You'd have to do something to take up your time. But being a young woman, I think, is just a different state of existence, because like women have to deal with the fact that men want them. So while it's true a woman can do the same thing, like she can get a job and she can read books, dealing with the reality that men are going to try to date her is kind of just a different experience that I don't think a lot of men kind of think about or like really empathize with sometimes. So where a lot of men kind of have to like men are kind of defined by like what we do and our actions and our activities, which I guess would include intellectual pursuits. Women are mostly kind of defined by, I'm going to be honest, like men, like how men want them, like how they relate to men and how they have relationships with men. Because with women, like they have to have children, right? Because that's just the nature of existence. So women don't really spend too much time on, I guess you could say, like philosophy, because what they're mostly focusing on is how they relate to men. Whereas men have to relate to building the infrastructure of the world, so to speak, both philosophically and like literally. So I think that's kind of why women don't have to wrestle with these questions too much, because it's kind of not their job, quote unquote. That women aren't really like the thing with like if we take it back like into like antiquity, right? Like, or like way back when, if men ponder, I guess, the questions of life because they feel the pressures of mortality, I think, a lot more than women do. Like women don't feel that mortality until like they get pregnant and they might die then. But men have to go and hunt things, and something could be hunting them, right? Or men have to go fight people, and someone can go kill them. So like thinking about why your life matters is a bit heavier for men, because men's lives were on the line a lot more often. And I think just kind of over the years, now that we're in modernity, now we have so much more free time and our lives aren't in danger. We as men still ponder, well, what are we supposed to do? Because we have to do something to keep society going. Whereas women, which isn't to say that no woman ever has it, because again, like, if you go back to antiquity, raiders could come and like kill them and stuff like that could happen. But typically they wouldn't just be killed. They probably would be like kidnapped and whatnot or something like that. So they'd still, I wouldn't say safer, quote unquote, but it's not their mortality that's on the line. It'd be their sexuality that's on the line, if that reality of the world. But men, it's, you have to build stuff and you have to fight stuff, and in hunting stuff you can die. There's just more of a thought on our mortality and what we have to do with our time, because there's so much that we have to do as men. And not every man is going to be like a construction worker or a garbage collector or a lawyer or anything, but when we don't have that kind of stuff, it just leaves us hollow, because there's always this drive in man to do, I guess you could say.
Yeah, no, it is. I think there's an important distinction that I don't see made very often, because there are many women who are religious, and to be religious is to have a philosophy of life. Just intrinsically, I mean, to be religious is to have an idea of what is the purpose of human life to which all human beings should conform, and what are the things a person should do. So it is the case that plenty of women are religious, and actually this is the religious non-religious distinction is a very big one, because when women who are religious Yeah, and I mean sincerely religious, not really culturally
Yeah, exactly.
religious.
Because like culturally religious is a little bit hollow in some areas, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. But sincerely religious are very different. They behave very differently. They value very different things because they have a philosophy of life that is more important than just instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I draw that distinction between both men and women who are religious, who have or just in general have a philosophy of life that is that has at least some of the same properties of having like a human nature to which human beings are supposed to conform, and people who don't have any conception of or who have like a few scraps of a conception of what it means to be human, and don't but one that's so scrappy and just a few tatters of it, where it doesn't really give them any idea of like what the heck should I be doing on any sort of meaningful timescale. And I mean a bunch of the a lot of modern stuff, if you look at it, has that sort of idea of where the philosophy of life is do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What use is that? I mean, I didn't need someone else to tell me that, and that doesn't actually tell me, that one thing is any better to do than any other thing. And so, like, that's not a useful philosophy in any sort of way. It's held up. It's funny, like in you see this in fiction. I mean, you see. Mm-hmm. Oddly enough, the being a father, the fiction that I see is either aimed at very young children because my children are young, or, well, my oldest is now 12, so I'm seeing somewhat older stuff, or I tend to watch stuff from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and some stuff from the 80s. But like so there's an odd dichotomy and a definite like gap in what I tend to see. But like there are a lot of things, very modern things, which hold up where like the part of the story where there's supposed to be a moral lesson. Where they come up with like, do what makes you happy. Yeah, no kidding. But I mean,
but it doesn't really address why you should do it. It's more, or why does it make you happy? I think those are the real important questions.
Or what things make you happy?
And yeah, there you go, exactly. And then what does make you happy to begin with, right?
It's as useful as a doctor telling you, do the things that make you healthy. Well, dude, that's why I came to you. You're the one who's supposed to tell me what those things are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole reason I'm here is because I want to know what is it that will make me happy, healthy in that case. And so this is why, given that distinction, when you have people who have a concept of human nature, to which and happiness entails conforming, conforming to human nature and turning away from the things that make you less than human and towards the things that make you fully human. That those people just behave, think, and act very, very differently than people who have, like the highest philosophy they've heard is do the stuff that makes you happy.
Mm-hmm.
And those people have nothing to do with like whatever they happen to feel like at the time, since I mean the best their philosophy tells them is do whatever you feel like, which is a pretty shitty philosophy. But it more relevantly, it leaves no direction. And so when you're, so it seems to me that like a lot of online discussions about like men and women often seem to primarily focus really only on the group where nobody has any idea of what they're doing. They're just kind of doing stuff.
Yeah, there's no real purpose directing it. And that's one thing that's kind of bothered me is why, like I said, lately I've been telling people, the reason why you're supposed to date someone is to marry them. And the reason why you marry them is to make sure your children have a good environment. Like that's a clear goal that you should be striving for. And I think what happens is a lot of people get stuck on the, I guess you could say, the utility of the marriage, that they forget that, your relationship is what the two of you make it. Like if you want to have fun, then you have fun. If you guys want to play Monopoly, then you play Monopoly. Or if you guys want to go on a walk, then you do that, but the reason why you're together is to make sure your children are safe. And in between that, there's a lot of love that can be between there. There's a huge friendship that can be between a man and a woman. And, to what you're saying here, because there is no goal, you're kind of right in so much that it seems very hollow, and people are just kind of twiddling their thumbs ultimately because they're not actually having relationships with someone that they want to be with for a long period of time. They're just with someone that's just fun for the moment. And the reason why a lot of drama and bad things happen in relationships is because when the fun stops, you're left with someone that you actually just don't like. And a lot of the time it's like you're legitimately left with someone you just don't like. And so I think that, yeah, you're kind of seeing it what it is. There really is, it is very aimless and directionless. I can see exactly what you're saying there.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that a lot of modern people don't understand, that marriage has there's a largely self-sacrificial element to marriage.
Exactly. Yeah. I've been meaning to make videos where I talk about that too. I don't did you ever see the movie Doctor Strange?
No,
Okay.
no, too recent. I haven't
Oh,
seen anything in theaters since
and
about 2003.
yeah, you've got a life to live. No, I'm kidding. But so there's this one scene in Doctor Strange that kind of elevated it to me to make it one of my favorite movies. Is just for the basic overview of the plot. Stephen Strange is a surgeon who's really good at his job, but the only reason why he's so good at his job is because it makes him a low bunch of money, or it just makes him famous. It just makes people think he's great. And he gets into an accident and he can't use his hands anymore. So he goes all across the world to learn magic, basically. Well, he didn't know it was going to be magic but he gets there. They're teaching him magic. And so he's using his skills that got him through med school, his photographic memory or his great memory, his almost obsessive learning habits to really learn magic. And at the end of it all, his sensei or his teacher, while she's dying, she's like, you've done all this, but you haven't figured out the most important thing about this. And Steven's like, what? And she says, it's not about you. You focus so much on yourself, but the world is much better because it has people that fight for it than people who are selfish, is basically what I take away from that. And it's just one line. She says, it's not about you. And that's just so true, because a lot of people get, again, if we go back to the red pill, it's very much about, what do I as a man get out of my relationship with the woman? Whereas, what can I give to this woman? And then that woman will then ask, what can I give to that man? And so we'd have two selfless people working with each other rather than two selfish people trying to take something from the other person. And I think that's wholly the difference between what makes a relationship work and what doesn't. And it reminds me of another lesson. My acting teacher said, he said if two people trying to love each other more than the other person, you'd never have a problem. And so the lesson in acting is, if I'm trying to give a stronger emotional response than my co-actor and he's responding back, we're both bouncing off of each other, trying to rise the tension, and that's what makes the scene more dynamic. And the lesson in a relationship is, if I'm trying to love you, I'm trying to protect you and help you out, and you try to do that back to me, we have two people just trying to help each other out. So we're not trying to hurt each other. We're trying to make life better for one another. And so those are the lessons I get out of that. And again,
Well, and
like
there's actually a
go
further
ahead.
point.
Go ahead.
So just there's a further point, and then there's the question of, what can I and the other person together give to the new people that we make?
There you go. That's true. That's right. That's 100% right. That's true.
Because I mean, fundamentally, a husband and wife are a team for taking care of these new people that they made.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really it's something that strikes me as absolutely hilarious, is that that so many people in a modern context don't seem to understand. And you can see the existence of the fact that marriage is supposed to, I would have to qualify that one. Marriage will inevitably involve suffering. And you can see this in the fact that there are marriage vows, because nobody ever makes a vow except that they might not want to keep it. The only reason any human being ever promises anybody anything is because they may not want to fulfill that promise.
That's a good point.
It's the whole reason you make a promise, is because there may come a time when you don't want to do it. I mean, have you ever, found some, if you went out to the movies with a friend and the friend said, I vow that to the end of this movie, I will not stab you, you wouldn't go, awesome. You kind of ask, why are you making this promise?
Yeah.
Why is that a necessary? Why did this seem like an important thing to do to you? All over, like nobody ever vows to do anything that everybody knows they will want to do. I mean, has anyone ever come up to you and told you, like, I vow I will not punch myself in the face 45 times with a brick?
There you go. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah.
There are so the fact that people are making a promise tells you that it's supposed to be because they may not want to fulfill it. And so right there, in the very fact that a marriage happens as the actual act of marrying each other is two people exchanging promises to each other that they're going to do things, tells you that they may not want to, but they're promising they'll do it anyway, even though they don't want to. And to do something you don't want to do is intrinsically to suffer. It may not be, grand suffering.
I know.
Painful suffering, but like, that I will do the thing, I will do other than what I want to do is a form of suffering, because you have to necessarily give up what you want to do in order to do the thing you're actually going to do, and to give up what you want for something else is suffering. I mean, it's not, physical pain, but there's, necessarily intrinsically an opportunity cost. And so, of course, and as you've been pointing out in some of your recent videos, like there's a really good reason, and they start off very small and get bigger over time, that you will go and make promises to do things you don't want to do because there are some people who depend on you, and you're not really very replaceable here. So, it's actually, if you'll forgive me a slight theological digression, that like, God could have created each of us as just like a completely independent thing that doesn't interact with anything and just give everything to us directly.
We'd be an amoeba, a bacterium.
Yeah, just or I mean, you could be full of intelligence, but like just all your knowledge is just created directly in you by God with no intermediation by anyone else. But instead, we intermediate this. God gives it to us to intermediate this act of creation with each other. So, like, if you tell somebody some fact, that the existence of that knowledge in that person's mind is God's giving to them of knowledge, but He gave it to you to be part of that act of giving, so that you actually become part of God's act of creation. And give a hungry person food, and you become part of God's act of feeding that person, of sustaining that person in existence. And so in this manner, by delegating to us some of the acts of creation, God actually incorporates us into Himself as part of that act of creation. And so you can really see this, that in marriage, where a husband and a wife come together to take part in the act of making new people and then teaching them what it is to be human, which is sort of fundamentally an act of pouring yourself into someone else.
Literally and physically. Literally and metaphysically.
Which is also why you can also see like a lot of the things that men and women find attractive in each other is basically like, do you have enough of an accessibility to take care of yourself that you can take care of somebody else too?
But I'll put a pen in that point. You can keep going, because I think that where that instinct was very present in a lot of women in my generation actually have flipped it on themselves, to whereas they actually they don't need males' resources, quote unquote. Well, some of them will straight up just say they don't need men. But a lot of them want men with a lot of resources so they can be luxurious, not so that their children can be well taken care of. And I think, again, that's kind of the selfishness I was pointing out earlier. Kind of like the transaction, and it honestly kind of, the red pill philosophy kind of does make a lot of male-female relationships just basically be just a long stretch of prostitution. Because going back to what you said earlier, the mystery method was just all about a couple of hours. Prostitution, as we know, is all just a couple of hours or a couple of minutes. But the red pill, just like they did with the mystery method, stretched it out over time to now you have to have a lot of status and money to maintain your relationship with X amount of women. Sometimes it's multiple women, but they're only there because they just like your material stuff. They're not really there because they want you to be a good father to their children. They're there because they know if they have a child, they can get money from you. So the child in that end actually just becomes a mean to an end there for some women, and the selfishness, I think, really does kind of kill what's the most important element between men and women, and that is the fact that we make people.
Yeah. I wonder. I assume that people still have that ridiculous saying about why buy the cow if the milk is so cheap.
If the milk is free.
or if the milk is free. I heard the cheap version may have more. I wonder if the red pillars may have come up with some version of renting the cow.
Kind of.
As an intermediate. It's maybe, but like, there's some advantages to renting the cow, because then you get You know,
Well, the red
you can
pillars
ensure
don't
it's a high
even.
quality cow all the time.
Yeah, well, they don't even think that you could ever own the cow. They think that they think you are renting the cow, and then the cow's going to go away. So the red pillar's saying, she's not yours. It's just your turn. So basically, at some point, you're going
Interesting.
to be replaced, or at some point, she's going to move on to find someone else. And that's because her hypergamous instinct, her desire to find the best possible deal, never really gets satiated. It's never content. So they have to keep going on and on. Now, I personally don't think that that's entirely true. I think that that's true of some women, but I don't think that's true of women's like nature, you would say. I don't think women are programmed to be insatiable, but I do think there are some insatiable women that they are recognizing and kind of like projecting. So that's what I would criticize the red pill for. But they do
Yeah.
exist, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I presume we're also bracketing it off like women who have an ideal of human nature and do things like take a marriage vow that they intend to fulfill because like a human
That's
being should keep
different.
their
Yeah.
promises. Yeah, that we're entirely bracketing off that segment of the
hmm
population. Um,
Exactly.
okay, so cool. So now something actually that's really interesting about this is that what you'd think that if people are being realistic in this form about people who have no life philosophy and so are just kind of to use the term from Ecclesiastes or the phrase from Ecclesiastes, merely the cleverest of the beasts that crawl the earth. That the you'd think though that they would have some notion that like what's is the term sexual marketplace value the one they like to use
It depends
to note
on the
attractiveness
context.
basically.
Basically, yeah. You're okay. So your
Overall
sexual,
attractiveness.
yeah, your sexual marketplace value, I guess, is basically how much other people want you. So I guess, yeah, you could say how attractive you are. I guess
Yeah,
that is
as long as
basically a roundabout way
overall
of saying that.
attractiveness rather than just mere physical attractiveness.
Yeah.
Um, but like, wouldn't they? Because isn't that generally understood that like that rises for men since, at least as long as you're not like into recreational drugs and take decent care of your body, like a man will continue to look physically fairly decent into his 30s and 40s, and his earnings will keep on rising, and his social status will keep on
Well,
going up.
yeah, it's more about his social status than it is his physicality. Yeah, so physicality isn't really applied to that phrase that men age like wine and women age like spoiled milk. Which even then it's more it's not really exact, but so the idea is that as men get older, like you said, they increase their social status, they earn more money, but it's not necessarily that they like physically get better looking. Is that all their
Oh
assets?
no, I meant they don't physically decline.
Oh, well, yeah, for the
Like
most part.
you don't become um a wrinkly 80-year-old. If man's physical attractiveness isn't in decline in his 30s and 40s. So what I had in mind rather was just that the man's physical attractiveness doesn't meaningfully go down or doesn't substantially go down in like his 30s and 40s, but social status climbs, earning tends to climb. And so I would have thought that the red pillars would figure that like since the woman's sexual marketplace value is declining over that time and the man's is increasing, that that the problem she'd run out of hypergamous options that were better than him. Did they not think that far ahead or?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I guess that's kind of where the phrase I guess it would be really crude, but that I guess alpha seed, betas, I don't know. It's basically the woman then would have sex with, I guess, the alpha males, and they would take his genetic material, but then they'd find a male that I guess, as they would call a beta, or a male that is, I guess, a little more subservient and more willing to take care of the her children, to actually be there and raise them. So it I guess they do address that, but not in any positive way. Is that the woman would have spent time having sex or having relationships with these men that they're hypergamous for, but then they'll settle for men that are actually going to stay and raise their children. So it's not really that the ladies want these men like sexually, but they want their resources, which I think is a bit too, I'm going to be honest, Machiavellian of a thought process that any lady would really do that. It does seem more like some women kind of trip and fall into that reality than it's something that they purposely consider and logically deduce is their best mating strategy. I don't think it's a strategy. I think it's just something that happens.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious about this worldview because obviously it's wrong about like a large fraction of the population that has principles and does their best to act on them.
Yeah.
And has things like self-discipline and so on. But the I guess the thing that I find really curious here, because I was like thinking, I find philosophies of life, however meager they are, curious and especially odd when it doesn't seem like people are consistent with their own ideas, because you would think that like this would lead to nice stable relationships like once a man's past like say 30 or something, 35, because then like the progressively you'll be higher in value and she won't be able to do better than you. So unless you flip this into you being the essentially hypergamous one who like tosses her out to go get a younger model,
But that
then
would happen, yeah. Or they would be fine with that, actually. Like, to them, like, having stable relationships isn't the ultimate goal, like, learning all this stuff. It's just kind of about being successful enough to get a woman, at least once or twice, or have a rotation of women, which is kind of part of the reason why I don't really like it all that much, is that at the end of the day, it doesn't really ask for anything to get better. It's just more adapting to how bad things are now, and I don't think that
interesting.
that's sustainable.
Yeah, well, it's what's that phrase? Managing the decline.
Yeah.
That like things are bad and they're going to get worse, but we're going to try to keep them from make them get worse as slow as possible,
Yeah, rather than trying to stop it.
or look for anything better. Or yeah, because I mean it is kind of an interesting thing that if you bracket this portion of the population we're talking about now and go back to the one that has principles, you see things where you have like a man and woman who come together for the sake of their children, where a woman ceases to be physically desirable as she gets older, but as a mother and then a grandmother, turning into the matriarch of the family, these women become hugely valued by many, many people
Oh, that's
tremendously
true.
because they're wonderful people who give tremendously to lots of people and then share wisdom and take care of things and oversee relationships and help to reconcile people to each other and make sure that no family members get left out and so on. And I mean that sort of role is one that takes on tremendous respect when you're over on this side of the population that has things like ideals and goals and things like
Mm-hmm.
self-sacrifice and generosity and so on. So so it is the case that like over time that like her sexual desirability goes down, but it becomes irrelevant. Like once
Yeah.
she's had her children,
That's a good point. Yeah, and once a woman has her kids and she's in a stable relationship, it really doesn't matter ultimately.
because
I
like now she's giving to those children like what it is to be human, the knowledge of how to be human, how to be human well, and then to her grandchildren, and then I mean all of us are temporary and come to die.
Mhm.
But like while we're here, and I mean this, and the same thing becomes true of men too. Like once you've had your children, like your ability to attract a woman becomes completely irrelevant. It
Yeah,
doesn't
but
matter in
I
the
think.
slightest. Like,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
What I was gonna say was that which I haven't put in a video yet, but it's something I do think we need to talk about, is the fact that I think a lot of this stems from the fact that we don't treat children like they're people. We kind of treat them like they're like extensions of ourselves, and that's just not quite right. Because while it's true, children do come from us eventually, they're going to be their own people with their own thoughts and feelings and their own experiences in the world. And so, like, even like the topic of abortion, I think kind of kicks it off insofar as, you'll call a child, you just call it a fetus and say that's just a fetus that I'm just terminating right now, all that different kind of like euphemisms, to where we're not considering its potential, we're considering what it is currently, which I mean, not to spin off into that debate, but I mean, technically speaking, it's a living organism in its own right, otherwise it wouldn't grow. But that all aside, just the mere fact that the conversation doesn't start with who this child will be or could be, it's attached to the mother. So it's a fetus, it's not its own it's not even a person. Some people don't even ascribe personhood to it, quote unquote. So just from that part of the conversation, we then move on to topics like, you'd say, like welfare, or we talk about topics of like child support, where it's a cost to a parent to have children, whereas we're not thinking of the child as a person that can't take care of themselves. So yes, it is ipso facto a cost to the parent, but it is because a child who is a person can't do anything but be, like a child, they can't really do anything, you would even say self-sufficiently, until they're like 4 or 5, like walk around and like communicate, like really consistently communicate, until they hit like 4 or 5. And even then they're still like a 5-year-old, so that they can't really work or do anything, right? So it's there's a lot of resources and cost that comes to children, but people aren't considering the fact that children will at one day be an adult, right? Like they will be their own
Mhm.
person who has to go out and do their thing. So you'll see a lot of different memes. Well, maybe not you, but you'll see on the internet, child support's like 18 years. Men got to pay for child support for 18 years. It's like, well, it's true they have to pay money, but like, are they going to talk to the children? Are they going to be around them? Are they going to raise them? They only look at the cost of what children are taking from parents rather than what are parents giving to children as people. And so and because I feel like, because we're not considering that children are people, we kind of get stuck on just the mechanics of sex and just kind of the hedonism and the pleasure of it, and then we treat children like they're a consequence or a punishment. And
Mhm.
they're just not. They're not. I mean, they are consequence by definition, like they are the
Yeah.
resulting action of, but you're not punished by having a child. It's just the nature of existence. That's how you make people,
Yeah.
or that's how you become, how we be. So
It is. It's well, it's also. I mean, it's a. If a person doesn't understand life as fundamentally being about giving, I mean,
yeah.
this temporary world as being
Mhm.
fundamentally about giving, then children really are going to make no sense,
That's
because
true.
you can only be generous to a child. There's
Mhm.
no exchange going on. I mean, okay, you can say like, okay, in my old age, they'll take care of me or something.
But that's a
Um,
long investment. It's like you know what I mean? Like that's a
yeah,
long investment. And even then you can only hope that the child will do so, which it's a safe bet, but it's still a bet nonetheless, where like you hope your child wants to stay in your life and take care of you. If you raise them well enough, and even then they could rebel and not care. And that would be one of the times, again, you're not treating the child like a person, you're treating them like an insurance policy, you know.
yeah.
And that's what they did in China a lot of the time. One very interesting state of affairs in China is now there's a huge population of young men and not a lot of young women because of the one child policy law. So a lot of Chinese parents, they don't even think of abortion as even like an issue there. It's just, we'll just do it regardless. So to them they were like, oh well, females have no obligation to take care of their parents under Chinese law. So they aborted a female child and would wait to have a male child, because that male child will always take care of them later in life. So what happened was, because they can only have one child, the one child that the Chinese wanted were males. So obviously the population of females dropped significantly, and it causes there's lots of social problems in China, but that's kind of one of them. And
Mm,
I think a good example of what happens when you just treat, when you're not thinking of children as people, when you're just trying to like control populations. So, but China
yeah,
is its own mess. I'm gonna be honest with you. This so
yeah.
yeah.
No, it is. Well, it's funny. Even if you take it, so like, if a person doesn't understand life as being fundamentally about generosity, about
Mhm.
giving, for the sake of the person, giving because a person can receive from
Mhm.
you, and so taking part in that act of creation. If a person's not doesn't understand that to be the point of life, if life is just transactional, um, what's kind of funny is that the like, just how, coupling up with a person of the opposite sex is like why is that superior to just developing a drug habit?
I mean, it
Because
is
I mean,
essentially, you know.
heroin. I've never taken heroin,
Yeah, me neither.
but my impression from things that I've read is that people, describe it as being really, really good. And so, I mean, I understand, like, there is an advantage to copulation, in that, since the endorphins are
It
all of
feels
the
real good.
chemicals are endogenously produced. Your body won't create you're not going to kill yourself with an overdose of endogenously produced chemicals.
Mhm.
But so, like, in that sense, it's safer. Like, you can't overdose on feeling good from copulation.
Mhm.
But other than that, like all the things that are attached to it, if you have this in a purely transactional sense, like, for a man, a woman's a terrible person to live with. And for a woman, a man's a terrible person to live with. Like, they're horrible roommates. I mean, over the years, you figure out how to be a good roommate, and they figure out how to be a good roommate. The fact that, like, literally the two of you are just living in the same place.
Mhm.
But, like, eventually a man and woman figure out how to live together. But it's a ton of work, and it's not easy, and both of them have to be generous to make this work.
Mhm.
Or, incredibly rich and to have servants who can, like, fix the
And
problems
just
while you live in separate
obfuscate that.
wings.
Mhm.
Yeah, but there are a lot of personal skills that money can stand in place of. But like, if not for that, like, why on earth would you pick a the you know like, for a given man, there'll be dozens or hundreds of men who would make far better roommates than a woman would, and for the same thing's true for women. Like, and so it's kind of a curious thing that, like, this is a just a drug seeking behavior. It's
Mhm.
just like, okay, this is where I can get my hit, and it's nice, and it's legal, it's safe. In the sense of, you can overdose on heroin, you can't overdose on, like, warm afterglow or whatever. And so, like, in one sense, like, I understand, like, drug seeking behavior is never particularly rational, but I would love to
Mhm.
see some of these people make the case for why this is actually better than smoking lots of weed, or I mean, cocaine doesn't tend to end well, but, like, you can use heroin and keep down a job,
Mhm.
I
Well,
believe.
I likened it to a bit of a gambling addiction. A recent video I made.
Hmm,
This one
I
young
love that.
lady. Yeah, the one young lady, she said, this is why you should have sex on the first date, because this one dude had a weird breeding kink or fetish, which, for the record, it is weird. Like, it is weird. Like, I'm with her. I'm like, yeah, that's goofy. But then it's like, okay, well, you spend all this time talking to him and investing. Why don't you, like, have a conversation and just talk about it? And maybe he would be like, no, I'm gonna do this every time. And then you're like, okay, that's weird, too bad. But it's like, most people aren't gonna be like that. Most people aren't gonna just be, no, I have to do sex like this. So, but it's like, she just threw the whole thing out, and I'm gonna restart from scratch, and I'm gonna find somebody else. And it's like, well, basically, all you're doing is you just hope that you find someone attractive, and you just hope that the person's nice, and you just hope that the person has sex the way you want them to have sex with, and you just hope legitimately that you find a perfect person that hits everything you want, and it's just going to be easy and great. But come on, that's not reasonable. It's like, come on, that's not how life works. I mean, maybe the stars align, maybe all 9 planets in the solar system. I'm including Pluto in this one. Maybe they all come together. Pluto comes back, he's in our orbit again. They all come together, and you find that the Ubermensch, right, for you. But realistically, that's not what's going to happen. People are going to be selfish sometimes, and people aren't going to be perfect, and some of them are going to be aloof, and some of them are going to be kind of jerks sometimes, and some of them are morning people, some of them are night owls. You can't just hope that the person is good. And so what happens is, like you're saying, and it is like an addiction, where, like, you have a whole bunch of casual sex hoping to find the perfect hit. And then what happens to a lot of people is they find that perfect hit, and they just need more of it. And that might come with a very unsavory person. Like, the person might not be good. This is like, we usually see this in with young ladies because they complain about it more. But this happens to young men too. Just young men just don't complain about it more for, I think, different social reasons. But it's like, you find someone that you find attractive, and you have a lot of good sex with them, and you have a great, couple of first months. But over time that breaks down because the person honestly isn't really nice, or the person has different issues or something. And the people stay in bad relationships, not even because of selfishly, because of love, but they stay selfishly because they get validated because the sex feels good. And so they're just addicted to that adrenaline sometimes, or they're addicted to the toxicity. And so you'll have one half of relationships that's like an addiction, is the abusive ones that are really toxic and nasty. And then on the other hand, that's more like a gambling addiction, is the people that are just constantly shuffling out partners to find someone that validates them, or shuffling out partners that gives them the good sex, or that's perfect the way they want. And so, and I think, again, that's kind of the part of the materialism, where you're not treating people like people, you're treating them like objects. You're treating them like there's something that exists for you. They are here to make you feel good rather than you're there to help them. And, and hopefully if they have integrity or honor, they'll reciprocate it. That's how it should be, but it really isn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see that in the modern language, right? The relationship advice that's like, are they meeting your needs?
Yep, there you go. Yep.
And I mean, one of the things is like, aren't you an adult? Like, aren't you an adult human being? Shouldn't you be able to take care of yourself?
Yeah.
Like why is it you're searching for a caretaker? Like, I just like, if you're incapable of being happy on your own, there's some bigger problems going on here. Like, what you need is not, in fact, a caretaker who will, like, you're supposed to be like able to do, the things that you need to do as a human. Like you don't need a surrogate parent.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't need a surrogate parent.
Yeah,
like,
but essentially, that's kind of what a lot of young men are being asked to do for young ladies, which is a really weird and kind of bizarre. I'm not gonna call it a catch-22, but it's a bit of an oxymoron, you would say. And on the one hand, women are strong and independent, but they only pick men, at least to the black pill and to the red pill philosophy. They only pick men that can take care of them and have a lot of money in abundance. And it's like, well, what's the point of being an independent woman if you're just going to find a man that has a whole bunch of resources? You just kind of defeated the purpose of all that different training, and you just defeated the purpose of having a job and career if you're just going to give up the career to just get taken care of. And then it goes into, well, if you're being taken care of, where does that leave our child at? Like, what are you doing for them? Like, how are you giving anything to them if you are also a child underneath your husband, And I think what people don't recognize is that like if there is a hierarchy, right? The mother still needs to be above the child. The mother isn't being taken care of by the husband. She's working with the husband. So if the husband's giving stuff, he's giving food or he's giving shelter, that woman has to make sure the shelter is up to snuff, protective for the child, and then give them knowledge and wisdom and help them out, And that's kind of how it works, Like the two people are working together, not the man is just taking care of everyone with all his abundance. I think.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I always like to use the analogy that like a good marriage, one directed to proper ends, is a little bit in some ways like like a special forces team with two people on it, because like you're in a difficult situation. There's a lot to do. Often, like one of you, and you often will in these sorts of circumstances, like find you can't fully take care of yourself because you're busy doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
So, like it's very much the case that like, the various things, like you stay up with the baby, you're a zombie the next day.
Yeah.
Then the other person covers the slack because like, they slept while you were up with the child. And then, now like they're crashing because they're a human being who didn't get any sleep. And so now you pick up the slack and take care of them, because they were taking, and the child, because they were taking care of the child, and you were getting sleep at the time. And so like there very much are those things where like the two people will cover for each other.
Yeah, that kind of ebb and flow, you're thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's a, we various things, we take turns doing what we can, and then doing what we're good at and doing what's needed in the moment, and then that will produce its own weaknesses where we then use our strength to help supply that as well. And I think that's where a lot of people, the modern people who don't understand, marriage as that, teamwork to where the two of them use their abundance to give to others, they don't understand that like the things that happen within that are contextualized. That like, something like, if you have the, if you have like the single income thing where a man is going out and holding down the job and his wife cooks meals for him, it's not that he's incapable of it, but that this supports him in this thing that is supporting the whole family. And so it's a working together, it's a covering of it's a you're tired from doing this, and so I cover for that by providing food. And so like it's not that the one like can't take care of things, but rather that like it's a I see what I can give, you see what you can give, and we work this out where, because we're both human and finite and limited and moreover fallen, we will also have weaknesses, and so we'll cover for each other's weaknesses. And when people don't understand any of that, they just think of it as like, well, this is supposed to happen, like you're supposed to give me this, or like I'm not supposed to be able to cook. You should just provide, all of this for me, or I shouldn't have to do any of this work. You should just do all of it for me.
Mm-hmm.
When, of course, in a, like any sort of thing, like a person gets injured, say, sprain your ankle.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it may well be like you can't walk. Your wife may well go out and mow the lawn because you can't. Because like you're
nice,
covering for each
Mm-hmm.
other. In the same way that like if for some reason she can't, do something, like she can't, do whatever. By the way, did you ever by any chance happen to see my video on the utility of gender roles? It's years ago that I posted this.
No, I actually did used to watch your channel, and then I lost it. I have no idea. Like, I guess it just stopped recommending it to me. But
yeah, that's why that notification bell is important, because if you don't set notifications to always, YouTube just treats the subscription as a recommendation to its recommendation engine to consider the idea of maybe possibly telling you about it.
That's so goofy, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I could get into the programming reasons of why I think it actually does make a certain amount of sense, even though it's very counterintuitive. But be that as it may, the basic thrust that I had was that the thing about gender roles is not that these are like some enshrined thing, as if like, as if women can't cut grass or as if men can't do laundry, because like obviously anyone living alone does everything. Mm-hmm. But rather that the fundamental thing, or the main primary use of gender roles, is that most people aren't very good negotiators. And if you have gender roles, like societally normal gender roles, if the people are bad, if the people are bad negotiators, so that they're not going to be any good at saying like, okay, I don't really hate doing the dishes. You don't really hate, doing, mowing the lawn. Okay, I'll do this and you do that. Which, like, people are good negotiators, in a marriage. They figure this stuff out. Like, somebody hates doing something, the other person doesn't really care, then, like, you cover for each other. And, you swap some things around, and you make sure that it's, and especially if both people are being generous, you make sure that it's fair and that, like, nobody's, because you're looking out for what can I do to help. And since both people are looking out, like, you're not going to have one person doing all the work and the other person not, because both are looking out to help each other. But if people aren't, and most human beings are not very good negotiators, having gender roles means that nobody's going to be substantially screwed over by the fact that they can't work this, that they're no good at working this stuff out.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is it's kind of like just the presets of it all. It's that we have it, so we don't have to negotiate in the first place. It's like, you do this, you do that. There's no confusion. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. And if you can work out, if you are good at negotiating, then like by all means you can negotiate it. But if you're bad at it, at least no one gets screwed over.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so again, a thing where some people come out like, well, these gender roles, because like, well, this must be human nature. It must be that like a woman is made to do dishes and a man is made to take out the garbage. Which I mean, I'm talking about a minority of people who say ridiculous stuff like this. But I've seen this sort of thing. And you can see its exact photographic negative, where people who basically believe the same thing but then reject it, as in like, yeah, this is human nature, but like I reject human nature, so like no, women aren't made to do dishes, men aren't made to take out the trash. I guess that means that like men are meant to do dishes, and so to some degree, I'm not painting the picture very well, unfortunately, but to some degree you see some versions of especially like internet style feminism that are basically are exactly that, but just in photographic, this thing, but in photographic negative, roughly speaking, where they still have the same framework, they just like add like a circle with a line
like the irony being that the image of being an independent woman is attempting to be what a man is, or what their image of what a man is, and so they're not abolishing the gender role. They're just trying to become that thing in and of itself. And so it's like...
And often complain that men don't fulfill the opposite one.
Exactly.
You mentioned this stuff with like, like, oh, it's so horrible that men don't do the dishes and don't do the laundry and don't do all the dusting and whatever. And what they've done is precisely just invert the gender, say that like, okay, because those gender roles were bad, so let's just completely invert them. They don't have a new framework. They don't have an alternative framework. They've literally just inverted it.
Yeah, and then the thing
decided that's
Yeah,
emancipation.
exactly. And yeah, exactly. And it's not just that that's what they decide in pants. I can't speak right now, but it's not just the fact that they have reversed it. It's almost, I would say, a little bit brain dead in the sense that like it never actually addresses what is wrong with it in the first place. If anything, it validates it. Like if you're saying I as a woman want to be this and I want you as a man to do that, then the question is, well, what was the problem? Was the problem just the fact that you don't have the correct parts, you're born the wrong gender, you're born the wrong sex? Like what if you're going to attempt to be what a man is and you want the man to then be what a woman is supposed to be, what was ever the issue with gender roles? Was it just you just didn't like them? Because if that were the case, then that means then there technically isn't a problem with gender roles. You just didn't like what you had to do. So you just can just not. You can just not be that woman instead of trying to dismantle the whole entire thing. It's kind
Yeah,
of the
well,
thought I was having.
and occasionally you see some ridiculous things. They're like, okay, then let's split this equally. So we'll like each, we'll do this on alternate days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just try it. Like just try
No,
taking every
we did try it.
chore that's done throughout a house and split it on alternate days and see how well this works.
Yeah.
And
No,
the answer
then,
is it doesn't. It's just the amount of intellectual overhead involved in having a complex system of alternation is so much. What inevitably happens whenever you try to do this, unless you're like in like a community that actually like has that will like literally have a rotation with like
mm-hmm.
an actual schedule and so on.
Yeah, you have a little
Because like
calendar on the wall.
yeah, and like my understanding, even there, you often just divide up tasks differently. But that said, like if in a household with only like two adults plus some children, so the children aren't going to be doing most of this work, like having everywhere on like next to the vacuum cleaner and next to the dishwasher and next to the washing machine and so on, the chart of who does what when. Like the amount of mental overhead involved in figuring out like, okay, this is a Tuesday on an odd numbered calendar day. So that means like, because you can't like do everything, I do everything today, you do everything tomorrow. And amongst other things, no one does the washing every day. So, like if you tried to ever work this out in practice, what always inevitably happens is it falls to, okay, look, I'll just always be the one who does this if you're always the one who does that.
Yeah.
And so
You just kind of skip
it's
the
just,
middleman.
yeah. So, I mean, and a lot of what you see in life is, a lot of the modern world is trying to reorder society from people who aren't good at doing stuff in favor of the people who are. That is to say, like screwing over the majority for the sake of the minority. Of like, instead of having a system that works for most people and people who are good at negotiating can like figure out what they want, it's throw that entire thing out, and then we'll just have a sort of chaos where only the people who happen to be gifted enough to be really good at figuring, navigating that sort of chaos out will be able to navigate, and everyone else is lost in a sort of chaotic, whirling system of that they can't really deal with. And so, everyone needs therapy and antidepressants. So you see a lot of that, and I think to bring it around and sort of to, I guess, to bring this because I guess we didn't have the conversations always take on a life of their own. We didn't really get to the sort of more depth, less breadth than I thought initially we might do. But would you say it's fair that that for a lot that a lot of these systems, whichever color of pill it may be, or whichever ism, that they're all essentially like things that have jettisoned an actual structural idea of life, and that what they're doing is they've picked a small idea of how to navigate the ensuing chaos. And so in that sense, they're like really crappy little religion replacements, because they give you like, it's instead of being like on a ship at sea, you've got like, two planks that you're holding on to, and somebody else has, a plank and half of a wine cask, and somebody else has their, so does that seem accurate to you? When of the stuff that you see and the things, that you respond to in videos, does that seem like an accurate description of what you survey?
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think it's interesting to me that even atheists always seem to try to put their faith into something. least they just kind of unfortunately want to commit suicide or just give up. I think every human wants to believe that there's something greater than them or some kind of cause or some kind of power. And for some of them, it's not necessarily God. They'll sometimes they just make it up. I think the hedonism that is kind of like the red pill, or I guess the quote unquote practicality of the red pill, and the kind of doomer mentality of the black pill is just kind of the religion these people have just decided they wanted to follow, unfortunately. Insofar as the red pillars, they just kind of do what's necessary to get women, and that's just kind of their prime directive. I'm just gonna do what I need to do to get women. It doesn't matter if it makes me a worse person. It's just what has to be done. Whereas the black pillars are like, well, it's game over for me regardless, so I'm not even going to try. And I'm just, I'll just rot away eventually. And which isn't all of them, of course, but there's a lot of that in there. And I think the problem is it's a very I think in principle a lot of it is really, really hopeless. And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems with it is it's born from hopelessness, and it just kind of is a way of more managing the hopelessness than doing anything about it.
Mm.
Because the red pill isn't ultimately about how do I find a woman to be with and marry and have a family with. It's about how do I find a woman to have sex with for a long period of time, and then how do I find the next woman, or like how do I manage this woman and keep her around so I get what I want. It's not about actually sacrificing for her, being a good man to her. It's about what do I have to do to get what I want from her. And ultimately it's just not going to make you happy.
Mm. And one final question,
Mhm.
actually, is how are you finding, as you've been pushing more about the inadequacy of these sorts of pseudo philosophies and the need to have a real, actual purpose that rationally makes sense
Mhm.
and has some actually good goal at the end of it. How are you finding this is being received?
Um, there are some people that they don't care. I've got a couple of different black pillars that I'm gonna try to help out, and I'm not gonna give up on them. I'm gonna try to help them out and push them to get there. So there's some people that's them, but for the most part, most of my audience are pretty switched on guys. They if at the very least they're trying to not be degenerate. They're not trying to like fold into this and just do what their pee say. You know what I mean? And just operate hedonistically. There are people that are like, there's something's got to be done, and we have to be those people that do something. So for the most part, I haven't. I'm pleasantly surprised, I would say, by most of the people that comment on my videos or respond to me. Um, they're pretty good people. I think whenever I get individuals that do disagree with me, it's often they disagree with what they expect I'm supposed to say, or they disagree more with
Mm.
like they would say the ideology they think I'm a part of rather than what I actually say. Because I'm not technically red pillar or technically black pill. I'm just like, all right, this is the state of affairs. We need to do something about it. So that's how I feel.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for taking the time.
No, of course, man. No, I've learned things from you too, and that's one of the best things I think about your channel is you're older than me. You've had different life experiences, and you see the world differently, and I think that's probably one of the best things. When I go on your channel, I'm always like, wow, I didn't even think about that. You made your video response to me, and I was like, wow. The whole time I was like, that's a great point. Yeah. The idea of making sure that you don't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory or something like that you said. And I was like, that's actually a really good point I didn't consider. So I'm really glad that I found your channel again. You found me. I don't know, I'm glad you reached out to me, and I'm glad I get to see your videos because they're always very eye-opening. You have a really good perspective on things.
Oh, well, thank you. It's literally a pleasure to be of service.
Mhm.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.